Standing on the edge of the crater, like the prophets once said.
How is Skullface linked to Big Boss? What's the significance of the soundtrack and that Mark Twain quote? What does it all have to do with Solid and Liquid Snake? Plus is Kojima saving his biggest secret until last? I'm Dan Dawkins and I hope to answer all these questions in this analysis of the E3 2014 trailer. Plus I'll be back soon with another video showing how all this links to wider conspiracies about the MGS5 plot. If you enjoy this video, please be kind enough to click the like button and do subscribe for more MGS analysis from myself really soon. Right, let's go. On the surface, the trailer's opening quote from Mark Twain seems fairly obvious in terms of reading it. The bigger point is not so much about the quote itself, but the author. Now, Mark Twain's obvious popular work is The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, but there are two pieces of work for which Mark Twain is famous that might have a wider implication for Metal Gear Solid 5. The first is his book, A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, which features a time traveller from the contemporary US. He uses his knowledge of science to introduce modern technology to Arthurian England. A much more interesting work of Mark Twain's is The Prince and the Pauper. It tells the stories of two boys born on the same day who were physically identical, and the book acts as a social commentary as the Prince and Pauper switch places. Now, it doesn't take much to imagine two physically identical characters within the Metal Gear Solid universe, and given the context of this game, after the Les Enfants Terribles project, which births Solid and Liquid Snake, who are on the surface visually identical, could this be a deliberate overture from Kojima? The trailer opens with depictions of dead bodies, a scene that's clearly been burnt to the ground. Now, a question mark is over the nature of these bodies. Are they, as the chronology of the trailer suggests, Diamond Dog's team members or soldiers? Well, that's what you're led to believe, but possibly not. When you look closer at the bodies, a lot of them seem to be unclothed, they've got darker skin. It seems more likely that they're the African child soldiers as glimpsed in the E3 2013 video. But again, because of the nature of how burnt they are, it's hard to be 100% sure. If there's any debate about where this is taking place, the vulture, or the red-headed vulture, is something of a giveaway, and that's often found in places of India and parts of Asia. But also, this is like an old world vulture, as they know, looking at the markings, and these were very often found in Africa. Now, we already know that a large part of Metal Gear Solid 5 will be set in Africa, so this seems to set the location. We see Big Boss striding into the scene. It's worth noting the belt that hangs from the back of his trousers there. That's supposed to symbolise almost like a tail, to make him more symbolically like a demon to match his horn. We don't glimpse Big Boss face on, but we can tell that he's soaked in blood, and it doesn't seem too big a leap to connect this scene to the one later on where he's crying out in pain and literally drenched in red. You all note the trees in the background as well also connect this scene to the African settings we've seen in previous trailers. Here we see Big Boss standing in front of the cremated coffins of his fallen Diamond Dog's teammates. We can see four lines of coffins arranged in rows of three. There's another 3 burning, so that's at least 15 soldiers dead. It could be that these are the soldiers who were killed in the attack on Mother Base at the end of Metal Gear Solid Ground Zeroes. Again, it's maybe a deliberate confusion with the chronology, as in, would those bodies have been kept alive in the 9 years since Big Boss emerged from his coma? And again, it assumes that the coma takes place straight away after Ground Zeroes. I know that seems like it's obvious, but again, we're making a lot of assumptions with a lot of these trailers. We see Miller enter the scene. Now, this isn't the Kaz Miller we see in Metal Gear Ground Zeroes. This is the post-Afghanistan recovery Kaz Miller, wearing his beret. He's got his crutch, and he's got his leg replacement stump as well. So this is clearly after Big Boss has recovered him from Afghanistan, which again we assume to be after he awakes from the coma, which again would suggest that these bodies have been sitting around, waiting for this moment. So again, the theory that they are the bodies from Mother Base all those 9-10 years ago seems slightly askew. Could these be bodies of people who had died more recently? Likely, yes. It's at this point as we see Big Boss surveying his fallen troops and the cremation and the flames that we start to develop a very broad synergy with the origin story of Skullface, the Skullface villain of Metal Gear Solid Ground Zeroes. Now, if you listen to the secret audio tapes in Ground Zeroes, you will know that Skullface, he used to have a different language and work in a different country, where in his village, his parents would work in a factory repairing weapons for a war effort.
The factory was bombed. Some spies had told them we were making weapons.
And then Skullface talks about his village burning to the ground, the pain, the heat, the intense feelings of losing everyone he loved or lost, and then being taken to a military hospital where someone talks about putting him out of his misery.
A nurse in the corridor saw me and remarked, as if it happened every day, they should let the poor thing die.
Now, it seems strange that from that moment, that's the birth of Skullface. He's born in flames. He becomes someone who lives purely for vengeance. And he relays this in one of the tapes as he's torturing someone. He says, I chose to exist purely to carry on the will of those who died. And, that seems to be my only place in the world, to live for revenge. Now, it seems strange that the moment in this trailer that seems to turn Big Boss down a really dark path is also born from flames. Now, we'll explore this later on, but Skullface, at minimum, is almost there as a sort of analogue character to Big Boss in the way that they're both dealing with loss and the way they embrace it. But could this in fact go further? We'll talk about this later in the trailer. Now we see Diamond Dog troops on Mother Base carrying urns of their fallen comrades. Again, we can see about 8 urns that ties to about the 15 bodies we've seen. It's worth noting the way that Big Boss stops and pauses with one of the urns. Now I don't know if this is just at this time he felt he wanted a urn, or if it's this particular urn, and if that represents, someone who he's lost who was particularly dear to him. You could talk about it being someone like Paz. We don't know the fate of Chico at this stage. Could it be Chico? In either case, the main point is saying Big Boss has gone tropic. He's rubbing the ashes on his face. He's clearly a man on the edge. And if anything, this is a scene stolen from God of War, because Kratos literally has the ashes of his dead family burnt to his body. There's a nice cinematic cut to Big Boss then soaked in blood, literally top to toe in blood. Now, the fair assumption is this is earlier than the scene we see at the very start of the trailer where everything's burnt and it's just, the body's lying there. This looks like perhaps moments after that event has happened, as we say, likely in Africa. Big Boss looking stunned, confused, soaked with blood. Is the implication that either Big Boss has caused this bloody event in his madness, or has he failed to prevent an event, tipping him further over the edge? Next we see Revolver Ocelot, or Ocelot, clearly on Mother Base, working with the Diamond Dogs troops. He is wearing a Diamond Dogs armband, so he's clearly embedded as part of the team. Ocelot's history is far too complicated to explain on this video, but needless to say, he's been like a triple or even quadruple agent who, in the finality of Metal Gear Solid 4, is revealed to be ultimately loyal to the cause of Big Boss. But that was not always the case, and it's already been made clear from last year's E3 trailer that he's been described as a rival living a lie, suggesting he's already like a double or triple agent. We know he's worked with the Russians, and the Russians appear in this game in Afghanistan. It's quite cute as Ocelot walks through the base that he observes one of the Diamond Dog guards sort of copying his low-slung hip shooter style. But again, Ocelot doesn't give much away with this expression. Next we glimpse Mother Base, and this again looks a lot like Big Shell from Metal Gear Solid 2. Obviously it isn't Big Shell from Metal Gear Solid 2 because that's literally 20 odd years later on until it's actually built, but still it's a nice nod or homage. It's worth noticing the number of individual pods. We can see 4 on screen, but there's 2 additional gangways, which suggests at least 6 main parts. The Mother Base is yours to create, to customise. You collect items from the world with Fulton and build it up. We don't know how extensive that is in terms of colours and options, but your base will be attacked. You can look at it with your iPad and various different devices. Again, this is not really the focus of this video, but it's a fun thing to look at. Not much to say here other than this is Kaz Miller having just been recovered from Afghanistan by Snake. This follows on from the events of the trailer we saw last year where Snake puts his glasses on his face. He's wearing the Diamond Dogs logo, looking fairly distraught. Now, we've already talked about the potential duality between Skullface and Big Boss. It's also worth noting the duality between Big Boss and Kaz at this stage, where Miller has lost his right arm, Big Boss has lost his left arm. Now we know Miller has lost an eye, obviously Big Boss has lost an eye. Now this could just be continuing the game's theme of phantom pain, of the way people lose things and their inability to come to terms with that, their sense of loss, being revisited by demons of the past. It's also at this stage worth tuning out and turning up the audio to listen to Mike Oldfield's Nuclear song.
On the edge of the underworld, looking at the abyss.
Now, this isn't an old song, it isn't from 1984, it's from 2014, but thematically it fits exactly with what we know of Metal Gear Solid 5. In an interview with the Telegraph newspaper earlier this year, Oldfield talked about Nuclear, and this is to do with his conviction that he's still living with the fallout of his grandfather's traumatic experience in World War I. And he says, "I never knew him, so I hired a company to find out about him. It turned out he was a great character before the war, but came home a very different man." Now once again, this bears a very obvious comparison with Big Boss, who was once known as the great hero. The game seems to be supposed to be about his fall from grace. Oldfield's song fits exactly perfectly with that, and it also ties into this idea of a legacy, what you leave behind, and the sort of cycles of hate that revisit on later generations. This is of particular significance given what we have yet to see in the game, but we do know the Les Enfants Terribles project happens in the background. Then the sons, or the clone sons of Big Boss exist, Liquid and Solid Snake. We're yet to see really how they react to the knowledge that the great soldier Big Boss, who becomes the great demon Big Boss, affects the way they grow up and how they think. In the next scene we can see a series of choppers and tanks. These aren't Diamond Dog's unit tanks, but I would wager that they are in fact Russian forces. Well, why? Well, partly because in Afghanistan, where this clearly is, looking at the background, Hind helicopters were very popular with the Russian military. These could in fact be the MIL Mi-24 Soviet origin Hinds. They were introduced in 1972 and used in Afghanistan until as late as 1989, which is clearly comfortably within the remits of this game. Now we get to see Huey Emmerich again, who goes on to become the father of Hal, who's Otacon in the later Metal Gear Solid games. Now it's very, very, very heavily implied in Metal Gear Solid Ground Zeroes through various conversations that Huey is responsible for the betrayal of Mother Base and is in some respect, in cahoots with who we believe to be the real villains, Cypher, Major Zero, or the Patriots. It seems to be that Huey goes against Big Boss's explicit instructions that Mother Base doesn't receive a UN inspection. Now, not only does he say that, yes, we will have a UN inspection, but he makes that formally known to the press. So then it effectively blackmails, Kaz and Big Boss into going along with that decision. Now, he sells it in a way that that's the cleanest way to do it. That way they can get this stuff out of the way and it's fine. But it could be more insidious that he is, in cahoots with Cypher. Now, clearly, Big Boss thinks the same, and as it was hinted at in last year's trailer, where we saw Ocelot and Kaz torturing Huey, now we actually see Big Boss has instigated everything in this scene. Now we see Diamond Dog soldiers scrapping on the sort of rain-swept deck of Mother Base. They're clearly fighting very wildly, people are cheering and clapping. It appears that there's a really renegade soldier spirit being fostered. This is again to do with Diamond Dog's remit for revenge. It might ultimately feed into the creation of Outer Heaven, the soldier's haven that Big Boss creates. It seems that the traditional notions of structure and respect within this unit are being pulled apart, and he is breeding pure soldiers. Okay, now we can see Ocelot injecting Huey with something, we don't know what. It could be a truth serum, it could be some kind of sedative. It's pretty hard to know at this stage. It's worth noting as he cries out in pain, we get a repeat of the distinctive sort of tri-quad band light pattern. Now that light signature was a key part of the original Metal Gear Solid Ground Zeroes trailer, relating to something at the time I called the swoosh code conspiracy, where light bands would appear every time a peculiar piece of technology would appear. Now it did feel significant that those light signatures would appear. Kojima's since said it's just a form of lighting effect and tried to explain it away by saying he wanted to visualize sound, and that was part of the way you would play the game, so that you wouldn't be relying so much on furniture on screen, but in fact audio cues. Either way, it's peculiar that it does it, and there's a similar visual signature when we see the blades in the game later on. Now we see Big Boss land on deck of what again we presume is Mother Base, and he's with 3 kids, again we presume are African. We saw them in last year's E3 2013 trailer. Now they're meeting the post-Afghanistan Miller, who whacks them with his crutch he's using to walk about on. Now it's notable that, you know, Big Boss just hands the kid the gun, so he clearly expects the kid to react, but likely not to shoot Miller, or he wouldn't have done so. Now again, why is Miller whacking him? What's the significance of this character, or 3 characters? Well, we don't know, because there were several of them in last year's trailer. It seems only 3 have survived. Now you can trace the other kids by one of them's got telltale red welly boots, but this kid definitely seems to be the most significant who's holding the gun. Now there's online speculation that he's Drebin, the arms specialist from MGS4. Well, we can't stand up that theory right now, but it does seem significant that he's getting so much airtime. Let's see how this develops. Now this is a significant scene. We see Eli, who is strongly believed to be Liquid Snake, scrapping with Big Boss, who again is his father, quote unquote, as part of the genome, cloning from the Les Enfants Terribles project, originally believed to have taken place in 1972. We don't see him face on here, but we definitely did in last year's E3 2013 trailer. Now, if we needed further clues to the fact that he could be Liquid, there's a couple of things to pick up. One is the phrasing on the back of his jersey in English that says, "Never be game over." Now, could this be a play on the fact that this phrase is used by Liquid in Metal Gear Solid 4, and indeed in other games, where he says, it's not over, not yet. Now, never be game over is an obvious play on that. It would also make an allusion to the fact that in 1984, video games were an emerging phenomenon, space invaders and the culture of game over, one more try. That was a big thing at that time. He is just a kid. He would be playing games when he's not stabbing or killing people. So all of that ties up. Now, more significantly, there is a set of a sort of Asian, or people say Japanese, symbols on the back of his jersey. Now, I've gone through various websites and tried to decrypt them, so I can't verify this myself, but a lot of people on forums who are Japanese speakers claim that this set of symbols essentially says Liquid people in Japanese writing, which again I could presume to be kanji. Liquid has got a red beret tucked away in his shoulder. That could be indicative of the British paratroopers unit, and we do know at the stage of his life that Liquid has affiliation with the SAS. But as Liquid brings out his blade, it looks like it's curved. Now again, the trailer isn't quite sharp enough to prove this, and it might just be a trick of the light, but if it's a curved blade, could it be a Gurkha or Kukri blade, which again, Gurkhas were heavily associated with the British Armed Forces. In this scene, we see Big Boss pulling a knife towards him, despite protestations from the Diamond Dog team member. I guess the key point of this is saying Big Boss is asking him, how far will you go if you draw a blade? Are you willing to sink it, into a foe? We get to look around like Eli's dwelling. It looks kind of like a caravan. It's clearly the same location as we saw in last year's E3 2013 trailer. We can tell that from the plastic chair. We can tell it from the carpet. We can tell it particularly from the telltale rug that's in the background with the red with the yellow patterns. Now, is this rug of kind of Asian origin? That's certainly how it looks to me. Could it be more like North African, Moroccan, or could it be, an actual piece of, Asian weave? In which case, does that suggest where we find Eli is somewhere other than what we're led to expect? As Big Boss lifts the blade to, what we think is stab Eli, you notice the blade glinting again. Now, this could be the symbology of the blade glinting throughout the video. It could relate to something later on, where Big Boss talks about using the ashes of the fallen and carrying them into battle. Has it been that he's turned the ashes into diamonds, which is a real-world process, albeit one only discovered in 2002? And has he, diamond-tipped the blades to make them sharper and more reflective, so they are carrying their comrades into battle with the blades? Naturally, we don't see him stab Eli on screen, so the safe assumption is that he is stabbing the floor or just to the right of him to scare Eli. And we know he doesn't kill Liquid Snake, because Liquid Snake clearly exists in the later Metal Gear Solid games. Okay, here we see a soldier pushing around a POW. We don't know the identity of that person immediately, but it's soon pretty clear. It's the clothes that are the giveaway. Okay, here we can see loads of jeering guards who are clapping on some kind of scene. The lighting's very dark. Could this be Mother Base? Could it be another location? Well, it's worth noting that some people have pulled out screenshots from last year's E3 2013 trailer, and the lighting is very similar to the scene where Quiet is being tortured with like electricity rods. Now, could it be that that's some kind of live torture, and the Diamond Dog's troops are getting off on seeing Quiet being tortured? We don't know that, it's just assumption, but it seems like the entire crew are being bred to be dangerous, volatile, to revel in kind of quite sick activities. Now, as this person, who in fact is a female, emerges from the water, it's pretty clear this is Quiet from last year's trailer. Here's that scene we referred to earlier with Quiet jumping around with great agility, taking out guards one by one. She takes out this guy with a blade. Now, Kojima has said there's a reason why Quiet is so scantily clad. That hasn't yet been made clear. There's a fairly plausible but fantastical theory that she is in fact Chico, who was so traumatised by the events of the hidden tapes in Metal Gear Solid Ground Zeroes. He undergoes a sex change and becomes someone else. That's a theory for another day. Or it could be that, perhaps more plausibly, that Sniper is related to the very old Sniper, The End, from Metal Gear Solid 3, which is set in the 1960s. It is completely possible, who has a photosynthetic abilities and has kind of liver spots on his head that cloud and decloud as he cloaks. Well, in last year's trailer we saw Quiet's eye mascara sort of bleeding out from her eyes, suggesting she has some ability to perhaps see better when she focuses. It could be that she also has photosynthetic ability, and perhaps it's possible that her flesh needs to be exposed in order to access those abilities. Either way, that's a fairly fantastical excuse to have a scantily clad female character. It might be possible to skip over this slide, but it might have greater significance. Now, Kyle Cooper is a very famous Hollywood titling artist who worked on big movies like Seven. Simon Clowes' name hasn't been used as obviously in conjunction with this yet, but Kyle Cooper worked on a very big piece of key art that was released by Kojima Productions after last year's E3, where on a Kojima Productions podcast they encourage you to zoom, zoom, zoom. Now that poster was like an X-ray of Big Boss, where you could see like under his skin, you could see the horn embedded in his head, but there were lots of numbers and different key codes hidden on that poster. Now, a big Reddit thread started at the time that tried to decode that poster, which sort of lost a little bit of energy and momentum. Now, it feels a little bit like we never got to the bottom of what that poster really meant. Now, if anyone can correct me there, please send me the links, but there was some interesting stuff about how the JD name came from different numbers in that code. Now, JD was the name of the core AI core from the Patriots, which appeared in Metal Gear Solid 4. Now, could it be that the entire game is to do with the rise of the Patriots, the rise of the AI network? Here we see Big Boss being targeted by what looks like one of his own troops. Now, again, it's very hard to gauge the identity of the person in the chopper opposite. It could just be one of his guards messing around. There does seem to be a very renegade, lawless feel to all of Mother Base we've talked about. It's interesting that as the camera zooms in on this person, it does it in a way that suggests some bigger significance. Now, I wonder whether the person in the opposite chopper is in fact Quiet, who's infiltrated Mother Base for some reason, and is part of her insurrection that sees her tortured live and then sees her escape with the agility. Now, either the agility scene where she's taking people out is before, or it's after. It seems like she's got some vendetta against Big Boss or Diamond Dogs. Now, again, it's very hard to say, but it just seems like the eyebrows we see visible look sort of darker, bushier, more like female eyebrows that we've seen with Quiet. Okay, here we see Big Boss with what looks like a child's body. Some have said this could be Chico. To be honest with you, it's incredibly hard to tell. I initially thought it was Chico. Other people have analysed this, think it's the African boy who features significantly elsewhere, the kid with the kind of afro. I can't tell, but it does look like Big Boss is about to sink a blade into him. So, again, that would suggest it probably isn't the kid who we see looking alive and healthy later on. One of the key scenes in depicting quite how far gone Big Boss is, this looks like this is a follow-up to the very opening of the trailer where he's walking through the smouldering ashes and embers of all the fallen bodies. We see him cry out in pain. Now, he's obviously soaked in blood. Now, it's dried blood, so this again says it's after the bit where he seems to be soaked in rich, wet blood. The key part here is the horn in his head is absolutely enormous. There seems to be a clear link here to a scene in Apocalypse Now where Colonel Kurtz describes the moment he finally tips over the edge and goes mad. And he talks about like he's receiving a diamond bullet to the skull. Now again, given the theme of diamonds, the skull impact, the horn, it does seem like Kojima's making, very clear allusions to something like that. This seems to be the tipping point scene. Now the larger horn does raise some questions about the chronology of the scenes we see. Is it that after he emerges from the coma where we can see him with clearly a protrusion hidden under a bandage, or indeed when we see him in Afghanistan and there's some horn projecting but it's not so large, is it that this scene occurs before, and this again we assume is the scene in Africa with the burnt bodies, that his horn is huge at this stage, he's recently received this impact injury and it is in fact filed down and we see him later on? Or is it that the debris, as described by Kojima, the debris and bone in his head, is it that it grows as the rage or the pressure builds and in fact gets bigger as the game goes on? It's very hard to tell. My feeling would be probably he receives the impact injury and just sensibly it would make sense for him to go back and try and reduce the size of it by filing it down. So that would suggest to me this is before. It's worth picking up here on the soundtrack in the background and the tinkly noise, which people are saying is a Geiger counter, and it does, tie up with that. Again, ties into the Nuclear song sung by Mike Oldfield. The fact that it seems that Snake and his team are developing a nuclear capability, and the rise of the Metal Gear that we see in just a minute. The key part of the next scene is the audio, where Miller says,
"We're not burying them at sea." What then?
And then Big Boss says, "We make diamonds from their ashes and take them into battle with us. A shining light to our brothers in arms." Now this again ties into what I said about the glowing blades. Could it be that they're either turning the ashes of their comrades into diamonds, which is, we see diamonds being exchanged in this scene, and indeed in last year's E3 2013 trailer, where he takes and exchanges diamonds with the kids in the cage? Or could it be that he's using diamond-tipped blades as a sort of symbolic weapon of the Diamond Dogs unit? Now these series of title cards are significant for their background. It talks about being tormented by phantoms. This is what we presume is Big Boss being tormented by phantoms. Now the logo in the background is the Militaire Sans Frontières logo, which is from Peace Walker and from Metal Gear Solid Ground Zero. So he's tormented by the phantoms of his past, of that era of 1974. Okay, now we cut to an underground base, location unknown. Some are speculating that it is in Afghanistan based on the rock structure. I can't be sure. There's an allusion in last year's E3 2013 trailer to a secret weapon beyond even Metal Gear being developed in Africa. Is this possibly that location? We don't know just yet. Now when the title card moves to a Spirits of Ground Zeroes, it's the mysterious XOF or ZOF unit that's in the background. The XOF unit are led by Skullface, and again they're alluded to here as Spirits of Ground Zeroes. This will all tie up at the end when we talk about the closer links between Skullface and Big Boss. People seem to be unsure which Metal Gear this is. Well, some have suggested it's Metal Gear Rex, that's what it looks like, but that unit isn't built until 2002, and it makes a rusty cameo 10 years later in Metal Gear Solid 4. Unless Kojima's really playing tricks with the chronology, it's probably an early prototype of Rex, or as we'll come to, Zeke, but it is odd that we also appear to be building Big Shell elsewhere in the game, which is being known as Mother Base. Hey, it could be Zeke. We do know from Ground Zeroes that they are hiding a Metal Gear unit. What we do know is it still exists. It's significant to note that the person guarding it, you look at that soldier's logo, he's got the same visor as the XOF unit. Okay, the title card says Time for Retribution, Diamond Dogs. Again, it's just saying the Diamond Dogs unit live for revenge. Another key slide in the background, it says Outer Heaven. Now, as we do know in the grander arc, Big Boss sets up Outer Heaven. That is where a rookie soldier, Solid Snake, infiltrates on his very first mission, as told in the MSX game Metal Gear. Now, one of the big theories I've had from the very start of Metal Gear Solid 5 is that the game will conclude where the series sort of started, and this would be Kojima's stepping off point for his involvement with Metal Gear, having taken everything full circle, and would allow him then to I suppose, remake things, tie up all the loose ends in history, and essentially you would get to play as Solid Snake again, and it might explain the entire ruse about David Hayter being missing for this entire project, and the entire controversy about Keith Sutherland being involved. Now it says, Venom awakens. Now some people had said, does this mean, a link to V has come too? Well, we know for a fact that, Snake, as we knew him, who was referred to as Punish Snake last year. Now, Kojima was referring him to as Venom Snake this year. So, are they separate people? Has he just adapted it to Venom Snake? I don't know. It does seem to have significance to the final words of the Phantom Pain trailer, in which a Russian voice says, V has come too. Well, it could be that Venom has come too. Venom awakes. It all seems very, very tied up together. The further interesting implication of that is as if a nurse, or we don't exactly know who the Russian voice belongs to from the Phantom Pain, is saying V has come too, and it does mean Venom. That would mean that upon waking up, that person knew that Snake was about to go down this path of Venom, which almost suggests that could it be that the entire events of Metal Gear Solid 5 have been engineered by some third party. And let's be honest, the key engineering factor in all Metal Gear Solid games is the Patriots or Major Zero. Is it somehow that Major Zero is responsible for the dark path that Big Boss takes, and we play out through this game? We see Big Boss wearing what looks like his desert garb, actually, with the big cloth across him, stood with Skullface, who is the despicable villain of Metal Gear Solid Ground Zeroes. Now, this is where earlier on I touched on the fact that, there's definitely an analogue between the origin of both characters, both consumed by revenge, very single-minded, almost like, parts of their psyche were born in flames. Now, it's possible, and there is a theory that could develop here, that we've always assumed that Skullface is a physical, actual character. But again, so little is known of him, and I've trawled through the Metal Gear Solid back catalogue trying to find people who it could be, who would make sense. Now, it could be a kind of B-list character like Hot Coleman from Peace Walker, or Ramon Galvez Zardanov, who's in fact, Big Boss now wears a version of Zardanov's red metal arm. But they're not big characters, and it wouldn't be a very exciting reveal if Skullface was, announced to be that person. Now, again, it's almost certain that Skullface will be someone of greater significance. Kojima has half joked about that in interviews where he said, it will all be revealed, but it is who you think it is, or it might be who you think it is. Now, that says to me it's either as obvious as Skullface is Major Zero, and he is playing a character called Skullface in a way to out himself. That would be Major Zero pretending that the person he hates most is himself to extract something else from other people, or maybe to drive Big Boss down a certain path to a greater end. We don't know. That's only a theory. It's fantastical. I'm not going to really stand that up right now. Much more interesting is given the events of the Phantom Pain trailer, where we see Big Boss greeted when he wakes up by this mysterious character called Ishmael, who has exactly the same voice as Big Boss, Keith Sutherland. Now, Ishmael, to me, seems like a sort of psychic projection, like he isn't really there. It almost seems to be like the super soldier part, the good part of Big Boss that survives or lives through the coma or pulled him through. And there's many other different things we won't discuss here that would tie up with that theory. So let's say Ishmael is the good part of Big Boss's psyche. What if Skullface is in fact himself like a spirit, a phantom, or a figment? And here where we see the two together, we are in fact only seeing one person, which is Big Boss. But he himself is seeing this Skullface character who's driving him and alongside him. Now, there's a lot of things that would stand against this, particularly when, we have Big Boss infiltrating a base to save people, where indeed he would have been the key torturer and no one seems to notice or pick up on that. That would be weird and strange, but, maybe you could argue against it. One of the key things to note is that Zero does seem to know an uncanny amount about Big Boss, and they clearly have a shared history. There's an interrogation tape in Metal Gear Solid Ground Zeroes which ends with Skullface saying, "Chico, growing up means choosing how you're going to live your life." Now weirdly, these are the first words spoken to Chico when Big Boss first meets him in Peace Walker, and those words are shared between them in a room with no one else present. So how on earth could Skullface know that, you know, Big Boss would have used those words, or they would in fact have significance for Chico? Could this be a hint that Skullface, you know, in fact represents a manifestation, or even is part of Big Boss? As fantastical as it sounds, further fuel to this fire comes in when you interrogate different guards on the camping ground zeros. A lot of them talk about being in the presence of Skullface and almost describing it as being like in the presence of a spirit or death or some kind of fixture from the afterlife. So there seems to be something about Skullface that is almost supernatural. And even from the very start of this campaign, it's been clear where it says, from Fox, 2 phantoms were born. Now again, who are these phantoms? You would assume that it is, you know, it's Big Boss and Major Zero, who represent the 2 large philosophical factions in the Metal Gear universe. But could it be that, you know, the 2 phantoms are kind of Ishmael and Skullface? Whatever the case really is, it doesn't seem like either party is holding the other against his will. Big Boss is carrying his weapons. Skullface doesn't seem to be restrained. It appears that they have chosen to work together. Now and again, we often read too much into Kojima's games. It could just be quite literally they are as 2 physical beings deciding to work together. Why would Big Boss side with someone who tortured Paz and Chico and committed so much atrocity on his mother base and killed all his men? Well, it might be simply that he doesn't realise this, hasn't met Skullface and doesn't know. Or it could be that he does know all these things, but he is so twisted on a path of vengeance and so determined to get to Major Zero and to the Patriots that he will work with anyone. And this is really him going the full dark path and becoming, you know, the guy who leads out to heaven and becomes almost maniacal. And we see this in a minute where you see Big Boss shooting members of Diamond Dogs. Now it could be that sometime during the game, does Big Boss split away from Kaz Miller and just sign up with the XOF unit? And this is the scene we talked about. This is Big Boss close with 4 Diamond Dogs guards. First of all, I thought this was a bit weird. One of the guys looks kind of like almost zombified in his eyes, which is a little bit strange. Again, they actual physical beings? Are they manifestations? The blood suggests they're pretty real. There's a fairly violent reaction as he shoots one of them in the face. It does certainly show that Big Boss has, you know, completely gone tropic and he's willing to do anything to get to his means. And we do know these are Diamond Dog soldiers because we can see the distinctive interior yellow lapel. The sign says, coming 1984. Now there's been a lot written, said and analysed about the 1984, and could it be that, you know, it's going to be like 198 minutes after the 4th month, or all this other sort of slightly cryptic nonsense. My personal feeling is that really all Kojima is doing here is making an in-joke, as he's very wont to do, on the nature of the industry and the nature of trailers themselves, where it's traditional to put a release date at the end of your trailer. I don't think Kojima necessarily wants to do that. He's just making a play on words and having a bit of fun, saying, the game's set in 1984, my game's coming in 1984, heaven forbid you commit me to a release date, this game is ready when it's ready. Having said that, this is the guy who hid the words Metal Gear Solid 5 in the, you know, the inset cuts of the Phantom Pain logo, so maybe all bets are off. I hope you enjoyed my analysis, and if you did, please hit the like button and subscribe for more videos, including one very soon where I take a broader look at how this all ties to MGS5's bigger plot and address some of the larger conspiracy theories. Until then, bye.